allow me to introduce our moderator. Since 2017, Dr. Gayle has served as the president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the nation. As a physician and recognized expert on global development and humanitarian and health issues, Helene previously served as CEO of CARE, an international humanitarian organization, and spent 20 years with the CDC working primarily on HIV and AIDS. That was also her primary focus when Helene worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Most recently, Helene was an important voice in the COVID-19 vaccine rollout prioritization, and we as a country are lucky to have the benefit of her expertise and service. Helene is a good friend and is a board member of numerous public company and nonprofit organizations. Welcome, Helene. Now for our special guest. Almost 26 years ago, the club was fortunate to host Bill Gates in April 1995 for what remains the most highly attended program in club history, with over 3,000 in attendance. We are really excited to host Bill once again, today setting a club record again for attendance at our virtual programs. Back in '95, when Bill spoke to us, he was incredibly prescient, saying something that sounds amazing in retrospect. And I quote, "I'm sure a lot of you are also hearing about this idea of dialing up with a computer to an online service or a thing called the internet. That is the wave of the future." Now, as we all access today's program from our individual computers during a global pandemic, it is essential to hear Bill's thoughts about a very different issue that will also dramatically change our future. He sure was right about that internet thing, as well as his warnings about global pandemics. So I'm sure we will all pay attention to his advice and predictions about climate change today. Bill came to focus on climate change indirectly through the problem of energy poverty. After 2 decades of continuous study, Bill established Breakthrough Energy in 2015 as a coalition of private investors who support innovations that will lead the world to zero emissions. Last month, he published his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, which is the focus of our discussion today. Before Bill and Helene begin their conversation, please watch this very special video presented by the Gates Foundation. Thank you.
In a typical year, the world emits over 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And as we keep doing that, the consequences for human life will be catastrophic. When I first fell in love with computers as a teenager, they were enormous, expensive, and only the government and big companies could afford them. But my friends and I became obsessed with a wild idea. What could we do if there was a computer on every desk? And now the wild idea is quite tame. Billions of people not only have computers on their desks, but even in their pockets. Now the world needs another breakthrough. In fact, it needs many breakthroughs. We need to get from 51 billion tons to zero while still meeting the planet's basic needs. That means we need to transform the way we do almost everything. Our commitment to developing these innovations will mean the difference between a future where everyone can live a healthy, productive life and one where we're constantly dealing with the human and financial crises at a historic scale. Entrepreneurs and investors have to build new businesses and change existing businesses to get these solutions deployed. Government leaders have to enact new policies that drive the market for clean energy. And advocates have to keep their voices loud to hold all of us accountable for rapid progress. Avoiding a climate disaster will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on. Greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. My basic optimism about climate change comes from my belief in innovation. It's our power to invent that makes me hopeful.
Great. Well, welcome, Bill, virtually to Chicago. Good to have you here. And, I really so enjoyed the book. So first of all, thanks. Also, congratulations. It's just 20 years since the Gates Foundation was officially launched. I joined just after that, and, incredible things that have come from that. And I could spend a lot of time talking about that. But, let's talk about climate and the book. And so just, kind of taking off from, all that you've committed to from the standpoint of the Gates Foundation, whether it's HIV and global development, polio eradication. Why climate? Why did you decide that this was the next big thing that you really needed to focus on?
Yeah, it was really the foundation work that exposed me to the challenge here. It's very different than the way most people come to learn about this problem. So as you said, Melinda and I funded the foundation in 2000, and we built a great team, including the fantastic work you did on HIV and TB, which now has saved an immense number of lives. But as part of that work, I traveled to Africa. I started seeing that there was no electricity there, and that's so key for job creation. I wondered what we were going to do to solve that. And I also started learning about farming and hearing from the farmers in Africa that the climate was making it harder. They were having more years where their crops wouldn't grow. And so with that lens, I decided I needed to understand climate change. Was it going to hold Africa back from all the improvements that we expect to develop there? And I was lucky to get a lot of experts coming in, educating me. And so by 2010, I gave a TED Talk about climate change called Innovating to Zero. And I started to make investments. In 2015, there were two things that happened that year. I gave my TED Talk on the pandemic, but also there was a big climate conference where I committed to the 20 governments that came together to talk about innovation and R&D, and they committed to double their R&D budgets. I committed to create breakthrough energy. And that's invested in a lot of new companies with green product ideas. It's gone very well. We just raised our second $1 billion fund. But it was a few years ago that I thought, wow, people are very committed to this cause, but a lot of the sources of emission, a lot of the complexity in what we need to do with electricity isn't being explained in a good way. So with all this energy, we need a plan. We've got a goal that I agree with. We've got a younger generation that cares. But I thought, okay, I could write some things down based on what I've seen in innovation and thinking about these systems and make a contribution to coming up with a plan. And so it's actually worked out timing-wise very well, because you have the European Union, the Biden administration, lots of governments, as they think about the pandemic recovery, wanting not only just to get jobs and economic growth, but also focus those resources on the infrastructure to solve climate change.
So I want to get more into some of the specifics, and I definitely learned a lot in reading the book, but just say a bit about who you wanted this book to reach. Why write a book? You have a platform, you have the opportunity to reach a lot of people. Why write this book?
It's a complex enough topic that, we set a goal of only being a few hundred pages and condensing what I've been lucky enough to learn from so many people. And, without a book, I don't think you can go into the sources of emissions quite as well. Give the background, apologize for my own role in carbon emissions. The biggest takeaways I want from the book are not only the number 51 billion and the need to get to zero, but also a sense of all these areas of emission. If you look at the 5 big areas, most people have thought about electricity, where you have to go to green sources, solar, wind, probably nuclear in there. So that piece does get a lot of discussion, although the fact that it has to grow so much to replace other sources of energy, I don't think we've explained that very well. Transportation is the other one people know, particularly because they see electric cars like Tesla, and they see that's catching on and being promoted. But the other 3 big areas, we've got heating and cooling, a lot in agriculture, and then actually the biggest slice, the one that we've made the least progress on because the cost to be green in these areas is very, very high, is overall manufacturing, including cement and steel is the 2 biggest parts of that.
Yeah, and I love that graph because I think it really lays out all the different ways in which we need to change. And one of the things you say often in the book is that basically to do this, we have to change everything. We have to think very differently about the way we live, the way we work, how we get our transportation, pretty much everything. And maybe I'll come back to that, but just going back to the core issues, you emphasize 51 and 0. Those are the numbers to remember. Talk about that a little bit, and maybe throw in there, which I loved, was your bathtub analogy, because that's real simple. So talk about 51, talk about 0. Why are those 2 numbers so important?
Yeah, the nature of what we need to do is very tough. The scale of the emissions, 51 billion tons, that's kind of overwhelming because almost all of the physical economy involves emissions. And those emissions, go up as the economy grows, as the population grows up. It goes down slightly during economic downturns, and it's gone down a little less than 10% during the pandemic. But overall, as people get more income, eat more meat, build roads, build buildings, that's only gone up. And so the idea that now it's going to go down, and not just down a little bit all the way to 0, is very demanding. It means that we have to go after even the hardest categories. We can't just pick the easy ones and go after those. We have to have a plan for each of them. And it's not good enough for just the rich countries to get rid of their emissions, because in the future, most of the emissions will be coming from middle income countries, India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam. That's where most people live. And so we can't just use brute force writing big checks from rich countries. They're probably not willing to do that, but even if they were, that's not a scalable solution for all the countries in the world. And so, that 51 billion and getting to 0 is hard. On 0, the reason I talk about the bathtub is people have a clear intuition that, as long as the drain is shut, that's an accumulation of the water you put in, no matter when you put it in. It's just building up. And unfortunately, CO2 is like that. It stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. And so it's the CO2 from the beginning of the industrial age all the way, well into the future, that you sum it up. And that number, that sum, is what's causing this temperature increase that's creating the sea level rise and the intense tornadoes and the natural ecosystems that are dying off because they can't adjust quickly enough to these changes. And so that's why, just a 30% reduction, all you're doing is delaying how quickly you get to a certain temperature rise. You're not creating any ceiling on it at all.
So, we know that there are a lot of people who are skeptical about this, and you've been talking about this for a long time. What's your best argument for convincing people that this is real, that this is serious, and that we really need to have an all-out effort to make a difference?
You have to say, around the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we took a level of interest in climate, and it went down quite a bit as people were focused on more near-term things. However, this time with the pandemic, which is even more intense, people's interest in climate has stayed very, very high. And so I think that people are seeing the wildfires, the sea level rise, the coral reefs dying off, and although these are very small negative impacts compared to what you get as you go throughout the century and the warming gets dramatically higher, that's where you have entire parts of the earth near the equator that are completely unlivable, and where these natural ecosystems, most of them in the world, will have gone away permanently. But people are seeing those signs. They're seeing that, when all the feedlots are moving out of Texas because it's too hot. They're seeing the heat waves. And so I think that, along with just general societal education, the oil companies are spending less money on the propaganda that's confused this issue. So withdrawing that has helped a lot. And, young people need some cause that they believe in, they care about beyond their own individual success. Unfortunately, a lot of them, in a very eloquent way, have adopted this as something that they stand for.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you mentioned that a lot in your book, that the young people give you a lot of inspiration. They do for me as well. I think they take this seriously, and they want to make sure that we're leaving them a world that is not inhabitable or soon to be. But so one of the other things you talk a lot about is green premium. Talk about what that means and what are the implications for us as consumers and as we think about solutions to this.
Yeah, so of all the metrics that really say are we making progress, my claim is that what I call the green premium is the most important metric. There's a lot of other ones like the short-term progress that we should also track. But the way I think of it is that whenever we hope to be at zero, we'll be talking to these middle-income countries, say India is a good example, and saying to them, as you're doing these activities, building buildings, roads, making electricity for air conditioning, please use the green approach. And the response will be, hey, the green approach is more expensive. Are you willing to subsidize it, or have you innovated so that the extra cost of doing it that way is either zero or, say, less than 10%? So we can look today and say, okay, for all of those emitting activities, how much extra is that cost to be green? And so to give two examples, electric cars are a place where we've made the most progress. The extra cost that you pay up front, because those batteries are expensive, you give up some range, the charging time is a bit longer, and those stations aren't pervasive right now. Over the next 10 or 15 years, as the competition in batteries is very strong, the charging stations get installed, we move to 15-minute charge times. That green premium, which is only about 15% today, it's a little higher when the price of gasoline goes down, that one will get to zero. And so General Motors saying to customers, hey, you can't buy a gasoline car in 15 years, they won't revolt. That's a good decision even without tax credits or anything. On the other hand, cement is an example where to buy green cement, you'd pay twice as much. And so we need a lot more ideas in areas like cement, or else just that alone will be causing emissions for the rest of the century.
Yeah, cement. I never had any clue how big a culprit cement was. It was quite interesting. You know, another one is I think we don't think enough about our food and the whole food production. And I know you have invested in companies, you know, looking at meat alternatives. Could you talk about some of the innovations that you're most excited about, and where you think some of these can make a big difference?
Yeah, the agricultural sector is super important. You know, as you know very well, the poorest people in the world are mostly people farming and growing their own food. And they are often near the equator in Africa or Asia and having a tougher and tougher time. So even to adapt to the higher temperatures that will be coming, we need better seeds. We need to help out those farmers. Also, the agriculture sector, because that's where you're clearing land to make more farms, and that's where you have cows that, as part of their digestion process, they're giving off a lot of methane, or CH4 natural gas, which is the second biggest contributor to emissions after CO2. And so either improving the cow by feeding it differently or changing something, or by making that ground beef product in a different way, either by growing cells or by taking plant proteins and making those so you literally can hardly tell the difference. That's where companies like Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, many now have come out with those. They can't quite fool you yet, although in a few categories like sausage, I have a hard time telling the difference. But they keep improving it and bringing the price down. And so, it's a product without a significant climate footprint, without the animal cruelty or, manure processing and things like that. So that's come along more than I expected. But, we've got livestock all over the world. In total, that's about 6% of the emissions, and cows being a very, very large part of that. We also have fertilizers, things that go into the agriculture sector. So hopefully it can be part of the solution by growing cheap biofuels, but we will need far better seeds, both for adaptation and to reduce emissions.
So, one of the things you talk about is the potential for nuclear. A lot of us grew up with Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, and we think about nuclear as, a absolute problem and a no-no. But you are actually saying that nuclear has more potential ultimately than wind and solar. Could you talk about those, and what are the trade-offs between the different sources of potential energy?
Yeah, so we need to take electricity generation and not only make it green and keep it cheap and reliable, we need to grow that electric generation capacity by 2.5 times, because as we stop burning gasoline, we're using electricity to replace all the energy that drives passenger cars. As we stop using natural gas to heat our homes, we're using an electric heat pump now to do that heat generation. And so it's incredible as how much we have to grow that electric sector, but we have to keep it reliable. And so what's happened with the cost of wind and solar is phenomenal. In fact, without that, we wouldn't have the ability to solve this problem. About 80% of the generation in the future will be solar and wind. So we need to build that even faster than we have to date. We also need to put up lots of transmission so that you can get, even if wind's not blowing where you are, if the wind is blowing somewhere else, even offshore, that can be part of the contribution. However, we do get weather events like big cold fronts over the Midwest, where most of the wind and solar in the United States or North America would be shut down. And we can't store enough energy to power everything for, say, a week or two. So we need some source of energy that is not weather dependent, but is green. And the only highly scalable choice there would be nuclear. Nuclear fusion's well off in the future, although I and others are investing in that. It's nuclear fission, which, as you said, has a controversial past that could fill that role. Now, nuclear's been way too expensive, as well as causing safety concerns. So we need to start from scratch, have a generation of nuclear that's way less expensive, and that the inherent design says that, what happened at Chernobyl, which was the accident that actually did cause incredible damage, that will never happen again. So only because of climate I've gotten involved, and I have a partnership where the U.S. government is funding half of a demo plant, and the investors in TerraPower, including myself, are providing the other half, so that we have that. There's an option as we build out this large green grid, and I've done an open source model, so people who want to say we can do this without nuclear, they can plug in whatever they think is going to be available, and look during these tough weather periods to see if you keep it reliable, so you're not freezing people to death.
So there's a lot that each of us can do as individuals, and there's a lot that companies can do. And you've said many times you are probably not the best poster child for low carbon footprint. You fly around in private jets and all the rest. But there are things that people can do to offset that, and there are things that people can do to make a difference even if they don't have a large carbon footprint. So could you talk about what individuals can do that really makes a difference? Because some of the things we talk about may not really have a huge impact, but what can individuals do? And then, because the Economic Club is a lot of our members are corporate leaders, what can corporations do? What can companies do? And how should people be thinking about it from their individual, but also from their organizational standpoint?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is getting educated about climate is key. Even some people who believe in it, their ability to talk about the damage and what we need to do, the more we strengthen that, the more we'll get a better plan. And if you can share that with other people, including people who are in a different political party than you are, and build that level of understanding. So even if we disagree about the tactics, we agree that the goal of getting to zero is very important. So education, I'd put first. I'd put your political voice, voting for candidates who want to prioritize this problem. I'd put that second. I'd put your behavior as a consumer, buying greener products, an electric car if you can afford that. Trying out the synthetic meat, and as that gets better and better, making that a higher portion of your diet. Some degree, if something's frivolous, then consuming a bit less just means that the amount we have to convert is reduced by that. And then finally, your point about companies is a super important one. You look at your employer and say, okay, are they doing enough? Are they computing their emissions and reporting that? Are they starting to pay for offsets? Maybe not 100% offset, but the more funding for that activity, the better. And we need companies to come in and be customers. So, if they're building a new building, they can use some green steel and green cement. If their employees are flying, they can buy some green aviation fuel. They can look at their buildings in terms of how efficient those are. And so corporations, we're asking them to not only do these things, but come together under an effort we call Catalyst, which is will be buying, drive the demand for those green products so that we can get the volume up, and the same sort of price improvement that we saw with solar cells and wind and the lithium-ion batteries that go on those electric cars. Those prices came down a lot, but that it was key to create that initial demand. And so for some of the hard areas like cement and steel, we're just now figuring out, okay, how do you drive that demand? And companies in finance and technology and mining, we're calling them up and say, hey, join this catalyst movement to get these hard categories into the same position that the good categories like electric cars have gotten into, where the green premium really is going to come down to zero, and then you can focus in on the solving the other top problems. And the response from the companies has been very strong. Now I think there's a lot of industries where society and the employees are pushing, and that's very timely.
And it's good to see that progress. On the other hand, that takes a lot of time, and just depending on people's goodwill and learning and kind of becoming educated about this, takes time. And I wonder what you think about the role of government and policies. We love to think that everybody would just step up there and do their part, but is there a role for government? Is there a role for policy change? What are some of the policies that you think would incentivize individuals as well as companies to really step up and play their role?
Yeah, so government is totally crucial. So, that's why for individuals, this idea of speaking out and hopefully making this a bipartisan issue is absolutely necessary. Government funds the basic research, and we need to raise the amount of going into that to be similar to what we put into healthcare research. The government creates the regulations that have requirements. The government's a big buyer. The government does tax credits. And so those tax credits have helped a lot with solar and wind. Now we need to add tax credits for the other categories like storage, direct air capture, green aviation fuel, and start to create the demand for those things as well. Fortunately, the Biden administration views this as one of their top 4 priorities. And so some of these policies, more tax credits, more R&D, government purchasing, funding of pioneering projects, often putting those in the places where there's unemployment or where the hydrocarbon jobs will go down over time, so people can see, yes, this is an economic opportunity that with its innovation power, the U.S. can solve not only its own emissions, but create the tools that are making it affordable for the entire world to take green approaches.
So I'm starting to get the hook, so I'm going to ask maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So you started talking about the rest of the world, and that's kind of how you entered into this, and kind of how I approached it, looking at the impact that it's having on poor countries. And when you look at countries like India and China and others, they say, why are you imposing these restrictions on my ability to develop? You had hundreds of years using whatever energy sources you wanted, and now you're telling me that I have to make a difference. How do you handle that? What's the right way to think about that? And how do we get a global consensus around this that doesn't penalize countries who are further behind in development than we are?
Yeah, so if you draw a line, say 25 degrees north and south of the equator, that swath includes a lot of humanity, including a lot of India, for example. And as they recognize how bad climate change is for them, days that you can't go outdoors, crops that just won't grow, they'll become a strong advocate that the world needs to take action. And the clear understanding of how bad the environment's going to be for them, that's emerging, and I think will contribute to this cause. But it's fair for them to say that the rich world needs to help. You can't just say, hey, we're all on our own here, because that power to innovate, that ability to try out new products even when the green premium is high, it's incumbent upon Europe, the US, Japan, China to some degree, because they're one of the richest middle-income countries and they aren't developing their R&D capacities. That coalition has to come together, making sure we're covering all of these sources of emissions, because India won't go green unless they either get subsidized, and if that's trillions of dollars, it's not going to happen. The aid budgets to help poor countries, there's a pretty upper bound on that, that you and I worked on in all of our global health, your work at CARE, which was fantastic. We won't subsidize gigantic trillions of dollars green premiums, and so we have to make it easy for them through new products, innovations like electric cars.
So my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to our president, David Snyder, who's going to take some of the audience questions. But, I remember many times at the foundation, you saying that, you were really pleased with what you did with Microsoft when you talked about the computer on every desk and in every household, and you brought to people, this wonderful new technology. Then, and you said, though, that you felt like your years at the Gates Foundation and the things that you did past that were in some ways the most fulfilling. But now you're like Chicken Little. First you predict a pandemic, now you're predicting this climate crisis. What's satisfying about that? And, how do you think about what it means to be the person who is, talking about these grim predictions?
Yeah, that's a problem we always faced in the global health arena as well, is that most people are not aware of all the childhood deaths, how bad malaria is and how tough poverty is, particularly on women. And so when you first draw people in and you say, come to Africa and see this, they're like, oh, wow, that is really negative. But then the, admonition from our friend who passed away, Hans Rosling, who left us a fantastic book, Factfulness, right, is that we need to know how tough it is, but then we have to see that the rate of change has been very good, and bring positive energy to being impatient about making improvements. And that same thing is true here in climate. When you first learn all the sources of emissions, a little bit you're like, oh my God, can we do this? Now I have to learn about cement. Geez, I thought that was a solved problem. And so, yes, it can feel difficult. But then if you look at these companies and say, okay, what's happened? Tesla being the furthest along, but there are, dozens of those that are coming, maybe not quite that big, but in their area, very, very important. So you can get hopeful. Humanity has solved very tough problems. This one is unique. It requires more cooperation than other problems. And so, level setting and admitting all the things that need to be done, that'll help us build a real plan. And so if the pressure is there, then, every year those green premiums will come down.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to David, but just thanks again. This has been wonderful to have this conversation, and thanks so much for writing this book. I learned a lot, and I hope others will take the time to read it and learn as well. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Helene.
you, Helene. And Bill, once again, I want to thank you for joining us today on behalf of the Economic Club. So I'd like to start with the upper right part of the pie graph that you showed at the early part of your presentation. Our member, Eric Burkitts, who's with the Clean Energy Trust, notes that a lot of that activity takes place in the Midwest, including the automobile industry, steel manufacturing. His question is, as we emerge into this new low or zero emission economy, do you anticipate existing players in those fields to dominate the transition, or will there be a whole new breed of innovative companies that kind of seize that space and reinvent those industries?
Yeah, hopefully it'll be a mix. So now, Tesla's kind of embarrassed all the other auto companies, and now, they're responding. GM said, no more gasoline cars by 2035 if things develop the way they expect. VW's just put out a very aggressive plan for working on electric cars. And so the challengers help wake everybody up to these changes. Even the oil and gas companies who I'm in a dialogue with, they can help a lot with carbon sequestration. Occidental's actually funding one of the best direct air capture projects in partnership with carbon engineering. Their skill sets, when we have green hydrogen, we need to pipe it around the US. When we have nuclear waste, we need to bury it in deep holes that make sure it's completely gone until that radioactivity has gone away. So their skill sets, their ability to do complex engineering, big capital projects, they need to show up. And slowly but surely that's happening. The European companies are perhaps a little ahead, Total, Engie, Enel, having made those transitions. We see in the tech space that, when new things come along, they think, okay, well, all the old companies get knocked off. But, some, reinvent themselves. Even when the internet came along, people like Netscape, were viewed as sort of more native internet. And so Microsoft really had to do dramatic things to catch up and be part of that wave. And so reinvention is demanded because, it's not just cars, it's all these physical products will be very made in a different way.
Let me shift to another industry that's very central to the Midwest and Chicago specifically, which is transportation and logistics. So those tend to be very high carbon use industries. So my question is what do those industries need to do as of today to start that process, that transition to cleaner energy? And over what time frame do you think that it'll be achieved?
Well, in transportation, depending on how much of your weight is your gasoline, that determines if you can switch to batteries or not. Batteries are way less dense in terms of energy store. So something like a plane where the weight is over 10%, you'd have to be more than heavier than the plane just to have those batteries. So the difficult transportation things will be solved with either hydrogen or making today's fuels, but either using plants, so-called biofuels, or electricity, so-called electrofuels. That's the high end of transportation. The passenger car and up to some level, vans, but definitely buses because they get to go back and recharge at night in a straightforward fashion, that will all be electrified. And so it's not too soon for cities to plan for, let's, be a pioneer in terms of buying electric buses. I mean, they're quieter, the local pollution is a lot less, and it's great to see that's coming along to be something that can be used now, even with hot and cold temperatures, which were one of the things that held that back. And so we still will need transportation, rail, aviation, and cars, but the energy source will not be gasoline.
A really interesting question by member Mitchell Krebs. He's CEO of a mining company that happens to mine silver. Now, as you know, silver is a key component in many clean energy technologies, including solar panels, EVs, 5G. And his question is, how do you square the consequences of extracting metals, from the ground with your mission of kind of achieving those necessary carbon goals using that technology?
Yeah, so when we talk about steel, iron ore mining is other than hydrocarbons themselves, and limestone for cement, the biggest mining thing. And we use coal, a special form called coke, to reduce the iron oxides and get the metal that is the primary ingredient for steel. Now, if we can make clean hydrogen that's cheap enough, then we can do that reduction not using coal, but rather using that hydrogen. And so there's a lot of activity now about, can you make clean hydrogen from methane? Can you make it from water? Can you mine it? Can you use morphic rock to drive these reactions? A lot of good thinking about how do we get there. Mining overall, if you're having electric trucks and electric tractors do that extraction, there's no inherent reason that it should be responsible for high emissions as long as all that equipment is electrified or using biofuels.
Great. Very specific question again from one of our questions committee. In terms of what do you see are the most important emerging technologies in terms of achieving zero carbon emissions?
Well, one that's kind of almost boring in a way is transmission. The U.S. can't transmit much energy around the country because we've had local generation, coal and natural gas, some nuclear and hydro, and it hasn't had to travel very far because each region has its generation nearby. Now that the wind coming out of the Midwest or the solar that's coming out of the Southwest will be a huge part of our generation, hopefully offshore wind on the East Coast as well. We need a grid that's over 10 times bigger in terms of its ability to move electricity long distances. And that's been held up. The innovation there is more of a policy thing. Yes, there are things like superconducting approaches, but not that we can count on. We need the kind of transmission that you're used to, but we have to build a lot of it. It gives you reliability. It lets you source the cheapest electricity, and it drives this very green grid. The goal of getting there by 2035, I've got an open source piece of software you can plug in what you think the sources are and what's going on with transmission, storage, and nuclear to see, does it maintain this hyper important reliability or not? So that's kind of an interesting thing. Green hydrogen, you'll hear a lot about that, but if we can't get the price down to be very, very low, that's going to be a dead end. So we need to pursue lots of ideas. Even when the U.S. made a nuclear weapon, we had two different designs. Turned out they both worked, but there was a backup plan.
So speaking of innovation, a really interesting question from member Mayor McCarty. He is wondering how institutional investors can tap into the startup world. What tools or awareness needs to be taken among the institutional investor space to draw them to the clean energy innovation space?
Yeah, when I went through and created the venture side, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, I called up about 20 people who had enough wealth and who cared about climate. And I was able to put together $1 billion fund with actually way less effort than I expected. So the very early stage stuff, a lot of that is venture capital, early stage investors. But as you're getting the scale up, as you're actually having to build manufacturing capacity, that's where the traditional finance industry hopefully is willing to take greater risk and get involved. Some of the green premiums are high enough that we need philanthropic capital. Some of it will need people who are willing to have debt structures that are somewhat higher risk than normal. And then you need traditional finance as well. And so blending those things in, and so as technologies mature, the amount that's grant capital, the amount that's just risky loans, and the amount that's just market financed. For solar and wind, we're basically at the point where you almost don't get credit for that because it's a market finance proposition. We still need a lot of that, but it's when you go earlier up the higher green premium things and you find a way to get money to those activities, that's where the finance sector can contribute a lot. And we need measurements that track, okay, how are people jumping into that? I'm getting a lot of advice from leaders in the financial industry about how we can structure those things and, make sure that when they're saying they're committed to green work, that it really is the stuff that matters.
Great. Shifting gears a little bit, again, our questions committee was wondering, obviously the pandemic has created wholesale changes in the way people work, working remotely. Do you see any long-term consequences of remote learning in terms of less commuting that would contribute to kind of a structural change in how much carbon we consume, either through commuting, running office buildings?
Definitely, the pandemic has been eye-opening. I mean, most of it's super negative. The loss of life, the loss of learning, the mental stress, particularly for women, for communities of color. So in no way is it anything but an awful development. There are a few things in terms of improving vaccine platforms and getting the world focused on very ambitious goals for infectious diseases, like finally getting rid of flu or HIV, which, we can do those things. And I'm sort of putting together the, post-pandemic, never let it happen again plan, which in terms of government resources will be tens of billions, but should be very doable. As you say, this has caused us to question, for example, I fly to Africa to see leaders there, but it takes a lot of time. If I go that distance, they feel like they need to meet with me for an hour. Even if 20 minutes, we could get through the, say, health topic I want to discuss. Now they have blocks of time for digital meetings, and I can see them. Sometimes we need simultaneous translation, but it's very efficient. And if things get off track, I can call them back 2 or 3 months later, and we can get right to the meat of the issue. So I think all of us are saying, how often do we need to be in the office? What if it was just 1 week out of 4 and we intensified the social connections we developed during that 1 week? What if we took half as many business trips, and set a very high bar because we can, talk in a very succinct way with lots of digital information going back and forth. I don't think that will solve, the contribution of that to climate, sadly, will be fairly modest. If climate was a 10% or 20% reduction, this would be very helpful. The entire pandemic, CO2 emissions have only gone down less than 10%. So despite the extreme change in travel behavior, we're still building roads and buildings and meat and all those emitting activities. And so it helps a little bit, but it's really multiplying by 0 that gets you that the goal. And so yes, it will change things a lot, including I'll do things very differently. But climate, it's got to be not just a 20, 30, 40% cut.
A question just in from member Neil Joshi. He notes there are a lot of research and development going on in the battery field. And he was wondering, which battery technology or technologies do you see showing the most promise?
Well, I have a very well-informed answer because I've lost as much money on battery companies as almost anybody. There's a few that look very promising. It's important to remember when we talk about batteries, there's 2 applications that are utterly different. One is the battery for transportation, particularly the passenger car. That has to be light and small. Then there's the battery, the storage, which could actually be a heat store or pumping water uphill. There's a variety of ways of doing storage for electricity in the grid. The grid, the amount of storage you need is 100 times harder to achieve than the car. So people shouldn't think just because lithium-ion batteries have gotten cheap, that solves the battery problem. You cannot buy lithium-ion batteries where you're using them once a year for the winter situation, or using them every 4 or 5 years for the tough weather situation. That would drive the price of electricity to be more than double. There are companies like Form Energy that's doing a very different type of battery. They don't need to be super efficient. They don't need to be super light. So they're using cheap materials that put them in a different category. Now, that's an early stage company, but the grid problem is the very, very hard one. And that's where you have to mix in nuclear storage and transmission, along with over 80% of it being solar and wind, to get that much, much bigger but still reliable green electricity.
So, Bill, we do invite high school students and college students to our programs, and I do have a question here from a ninth grader, or someone who will be entering the ninth grade. His name is Michael Weiser. I'm sorry, I think it's Michael Weiser. And he's wondering what technologies or what jobs or careers, as he's thinking about kind of his next step to college and beyond, can make the world better.
Well, these efforts require all the skill sets. I had somebody saying that they like to draw diagrams and animations, who was offering to help me out with my website, and that was a fantastic thing. We need people who are good at advocacy to keep the intensity of the young generation here, and constantly remind people of the tragedy if we don't do it, and then some of the promise of the innovation that can get us to the solution. We need scientists. I mean, if you have an interest in science, I'm partial to that. That's not going to be the way everybody participates, but I do think making physics and chemistry more interesting, because why does CO2 cause the heat not to escape? It's actually fairly complicated to explain how heat comes in from the sun at one wavelength and goes out at a different wavelength, but it's fun once you've had somebody explain that to you. Then it all starts to make sense. And so the language of math, some chemistry and physics. Hopefully this is a generation that will find it, fun to really understand some of those things. So some of these misconceptions won't spread as easily as they do today. So definitely ground yourself in science, but if it's advocacy, if it's marketing, if it's running for political office, if that's what you think matches your skill set, you will find a place in the climate movement. For some people, it won't be their full-time job. It'll be the thing that they do in addition to their full-time job.
I have to thank Ken Matthew for that question. One final one just to close. At the opening, Debbie mentioned your 1995 appearance before the Economic Club, where you predicted the internet would be the next big thing. Sitting here, 24 years later in 2021, what's the next big thing that we should be looking for that's going to change, have a fundamental change?
As usual, science fiction, has painted a picture of things like intelligent agents. The movie Her has an agent that really understands all your needs. And so instead of going to, mail and then Instagram and looking for information, it's scanning everything that's new and able to understand your context and what's important to you. So the ability to interact, the current agents, okay, they're good at very limited things, but the deep knowledge of what are you trying to do on a trip, what's your relationship with somebody, we will be able to capture that and have a software that's better than matching a great human executive assistant. And so this is a holy grail of AI. Can the computer read and understand that information? Also, in virtual reality, we're not just, little 2D camera slices like Zoom and Teams are today. And that there you have an avatar, but it's high resolution. All of your expressions are mapped immediately without latency. And so that way of interacting, which is still pretty primitive and not ready for prime time, will move into the mainstream over the next 5 to 10 years. And so the digital revolution, whether it's online learning or online health or better ways of holding meetings, even when you're not all in one place, that's a gift that will keep on giving and giving us the foundation to do all this other scientific work, including things like, simulating that reactor. So you don't actually have to build it to know how efficient it will be, how it will deal with bad things. So, that digital world will continue to be in a central position, helping with health and education and with this critical challenge of climate change.
Bill, thank you again for joining us today. I hope it's not another 24 years until we see you next. Thank you again. And also thank you to Dr. Helene Gayle for doing just a wonderful job moderating today.